My name is Sissy Sibler. I was born Harriet Maxine Cattleman in Council Bluffs, October 16th, 1934. My dad was also born in Council Bluffs in August 31st, 1895. He was the oldest of 10 children in the Cattleman family. The year they emigrated, I am not sure, but it was in the early 90s, I think. And it wasn't long after they came that they went into the scrap business. And, uh, and the older children, as they grew up, the oldest one, my father especially, being the oldest, had to quit school in 8th grade so that he could take a load of scrap to Chicago. And he was 13 years old. And, but the youngest ones did go to finish high school. The youngest girls went to business school afterwards, and they had interesting careers. Two of them worked in Washington, D.C. during the war. And they all came back to Council Bluffs. My dad served in World War One, and our name now and has been, and I thought always, was Katelman. And on my father's discharge papers, I noticed that his name was spelled Katleman. That name is still being used by cousins, not first cousins of mine, but second cousins or first cousins of my father's. And we do have a large family, most living in Omaha, or at least were raised in Omaha. And many of my family are buried at our local cemetery in Council Bluffs, and it's called it's Oak Hill, but it's also I forget what it is.
Okay.
But we don't. But it ain't. But it's a very revered place because we have lots of memories when we visit there. My husband is buried there as well. Uh, what I am being asked to remember now is post World War II, and when the immigrants arrived from Europe. Many of them were concentration camp survivors, and some of them were displaced persons. And we had a very loyal community that bonded together to sponsor several families that could come. Now can I ask you a question?
Of course.
What names were the original, the ones that that began this group of, not the refugees, but the ones the local people that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have
Was
it in
it
front of me.
Gershon?
It was the Gershons.
Gershon.
And remember, they were Gershon-y, and then they
Yeah.
changed it to Gershon.
I think everybody felt, there were a few families that really took the ball and ran with it.
Do you remember who the rabbi was?
Was it Rabbi Korb at
Yes.
that time? It could have been was it Rabbi Korb, you think? At one time in our synagogue, we had a house next door to the synagogue, and the rabbi lived in the house. And we had a permanent rabbi then. And but when I was growing up, we had all kinds of rabbis. They'd come and they'd go. And I did take Hebrew class. And I remember the day that they announced that the war was over. And I was in Hebrew class that day, and everybody was celebrating. And there weren't very many of us in our little synagogue that went to what we'd call Cheder. But I know that everybody was very excited and elated about it. And I was kind of confused at the time. I don't know. I know that growing up, I know that we had little stamp books, and we'd buy little. You probably don't remember. You're too young, but we'd buy little war. There were little books, and you'd buy stamps at school, and you'd stamp them in. And of course we were rationed. We had ration books that you could only buy so much sugar and different things. I think we got by very well, having been raised after the Depression. We never knew what opulence was anyhow, but we never felt like we were missing anything. We had everything that I think that we needed.
Sissy, did you have a sense of what was I mean, you were a child during the war. Did your family ever talk about what was happening?
Well, that's of course they don't have communication like they do today. Now, with satellites you would hear it right away. But we knew I mean, we didn't discuss it so much at home that I remember. I don't remember that we discussed that. And of course you had a radio, you didn't have television. And the news service wasn't the same as what you would have today. And we were insulated, I think. We were very protected. But you'd hear stories. You heard a story about a boat, ship that came, and FDR, they had to turn it away. They wouldn't let it dock, and you heard stories, and you wondered what the politics people had. And I know FDR was always revered, but not in our house. My dad, the Cattleman family, they were always Republican. And I'd always say to my dad, who do you vote for? He'd always say Norman Thomas. Now, I don't know, there were a lot of Jews that were socialists in those days. So I don't know if he was joking with me or he just didn't, politics wasn't such a important thing when you talk to a kid about. But I did have an uncle that was always in politics. My Uncle Joe Cattleman, he was in politics all the time in Council Bluffs. But national politics, we didn't discuss so much.
Can you tell me how your dad's business developed from the scrap business?
Well, the scrap business continued on, and two of my uncles ran the scrap yard, and my dad bought a business called Russell Repair and Supply Company, where they made implement attachments to plows and things. The things were all separate, and you'd put them together. And he bought out that business, and then they moved it to another location on Main Street in Council Bluffs, which now is the location of our beautiful library. My Uncle Abe started Cattleman Foundry, so that we had a foundry, and we had the Russell Repair and Supply, which did eventually become Cattleman Hardware. But I remember as a kid, when in our new location, my dad had a man in the basement that was always assembling parts for tractors and plows and things like that, because they use hand plows, and all kinds of things at that time. Well, in 50, I think. There was a big fire in Council Bluffs in the block that our business was in. It started there were all these buildings that were hooked together, you know, and it started in a little bar. It was part of a big building that had a potbelly furnace, you know, and they hadn't let it go out at night, and obviously there were some ashes, and it started a fire there, and the whole block went, the whole block. So our hardware store, you know, it was an old building, had 4 stores in it, and of course we didn't use all that, but there was lots of stuff stored up and everywhere. And so it was the tinderbox. It went. And there was a Morphe drug was on that block, and it was destroyed, and Breeder Supply was on that block. It was a very, it was a big loss, and of course it was a tremendous loss to my folks. My dad just, I don't think he ever totally recovered from it. It was, he tried to salvage a lot of, because there was a lot of hardware, iron, you know, things like that. They used to dig and try to salvage things from that fire. But that went on and on and on. Well, so they did rebuild. They rebuilt a store, and it was on Broadway, and that was in the 50s, and it remained there, and then that's how I got involved with it too. My mother was always involved as well, and I, in fact, even the store on Main Street, I was just a little kid, and I remember it had kind of a high desk, and I used to sit on a high stool, and behind the desk there, I could have been, you know, 4 or 5. I don't know how old I was. Actually, it didn't burn until I was in high school when it burned down. But that's where I met Meyer Lansky. Was at our store on Main Street, and he came in the store for what, I don't know, maybe buy something, but anyhow, he loved to talk Yiddish. Well, my dad, of course, could speak Yiddish. He was American born. My mother was too, but he wanted to talk Yiddish to Meyer Lansky. He'd come in, and he'd always say, "Now you take those kids down, and you can bring them down to the park, and, you know, watch dogs and, you know, whatever he had going down there." So I do remember he was very nice. He liked kids. He was very nice. I don't know. It was I grew up in that store. Literally, I grew up there. My folks would go to work, and my mother would have a helper at home, and we had a big Irish setter that an uncle found when working on a project in Council Bluffs, and his name was Red. And Red used to, when I was in kindergarten, he used to take me to school. And when school was over, he used to come and pick me up and bring me back to, and he would know what time to go and what time to come back. And if he got to school a little bit early, before school was out, Miss Davenport would let him come in. And because the kindergarten door would open to the outside, see, and they could see him waiting by the door there. He was very sweet. He practically raised me because my folks were both working. let's see,
Must have been long hours for your parents.
well, yes, and it was a different kind of, Saturday night was a big night. People would the farmers would all come to town. They'd walk up and down the streets, so they would want to shop, on Saturday night or during all day Saturday. I don't think we were open on Sunday, but I don't think we were. But uh, they used to ride a horse into town and maybe tie it up on a parking meter. I don't remember if they had parking meters that early or not, but they eventually did. It was interesting. The Council of Non-Pro was right across the street from us, so they'd often take pictures of different things that were going on the street in front of our hardware store too. But
What do you remember about the community center? When was the community
well, the
center
community center, interesting enough, was on the same block as our house, but on the opposite side of the block. It was on 8th Street, and we were on 9th, so we backed together. It didn't back together, but it was, on the same block is how I would put it. It was a beautiful old building, and Joe Cattleman bought it. And it was, I don't know who was in there before, but the Constable of Sisterhood had it decorated. I think they had like Orchard and Wilhelm come. I mean, they really had a beautiful, beautiful place over there, and made I remember the women's had the restroom. Not only was that, but it had a big sitting area. It was. I suppose they played cards in there. I don't know, but of course there were card games and that, and they had the Sunday school there too. And on one year I was a Sunday school teacher, and I can't tell you which year it was. Well, it was after college, I think. Because I remember Linda and Dick Wissett were also Sunday school teachers, and the pastor kids were just little kids. I mean, these kids were just little kids. Yvette Rothman's kids, and I had the kindergarten class, and those kids used to tell me everything that happened at home. I says I could blackmail every family in Council Bluffs. I mean, they would tell you everything, and it was really kind of cute. They were awful cute kids.
How long did the community center last?
I don't know how many years. I don't know how many years it was, but of course the population was dwindling, and then I don't remember who bought it. And they made multi-dwelling out of it. It's what it is now, isn't it? And of course the neighborhood itself is not what it was at that time. There are a lot of old homes there that they have restored and made Victorian on 8th Street, but a lot of the big houses they made multi-dwelling, and it's not not the way it it was in my youth. And what else can I tell you about?
Can you tell us a little bit about, did you know the Gershon family?
Oh, absolutely. Everybody in Council Bluffs knew each other. And our synagogue was very important, I think, to most families. It was really kind of a social gathering place besides religion. Everybody, for the holidays, they dress up, to come to synagogue. And it was a big deal who got to read this portion or who was going to have a Haftorah or something. It was a big deal. We had a couple families that had, more authority than others. And Mr. Scheiken and Mr. Sachs, they kind of took over and let made some of the uh, decisions on what was going to be, and but the men would meet. I think every day they'd have a minyan in the synagogue in the morning. Now, whether they'd get their 10 men, but I remember many times they would be calling out somebody to come over to be in the minyan. But those are good memories. They're wonderful memories.
So you mentioned that you knew some of the folks who came.
I did.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I knew. Yes. Well, I mean, I met. When you mentioned some of the names, they didn't ring a bell. But of course, Ichkovich, when he came, and everybody that came, they found a job. The Jewish community all volunteered, the business people, to find jobs for them, as they did in Omaha and everywhere else. Because I've met, families in Omaha too that they all did the same thing. And they, not only that, they had an apartment for them. They had places for them to. They stocked their groceries. We had many. Most of the Jewish community in Council Bluffs were grocers. Truly, most of them were, and they were very generous. And people they all realized that these people had unfortunate circumstances, and they were given a new life, and it was wonderful for them. Now, I didn't know them all. I knew the Guevara family, and the Friedman family. I knew them, and there is still a grandson, I think, in Council Bluffs that I was going to contact and see. There had been some kind of an estrangement in a generation there, and of course Eric was born in Council Bluffs, and he maybe didn't even know his grandparents. That it was his biological grandfather and another wife is what it was. So they didn't. The Mr. Friedman's son, who he was also born in Europe when he came over, but they didn't come together, and the son's wife too. They came at a different time, but they both ended up in Council Bluffs. And Mr. Friedman worked at the foundry, my Uncle Abe's cattleman foundry. So he was very nice, an old man, old. His wife was young. She was not Jewish. She was not born a Jew, anyhow. But she did come to services. And the children, I remember, I think there were 2 girls and a boy, and they lived not terribly far from us. And I remember that one of the daughters was either, I don't think she had a bas mitzvah, but she had something. And that Rosie, I called my mom Rosie, made an appointment at her beauty shop for this little girl to have her hair done. And I think her mother too, as a matter of fact. And for the occasion. It could have been, she didn't graduate high school. It could have been, maybe she did have a bas mitzvah. But I forgot to tell you that I did have a bas mitzvah. I had a bas mitzvah. I was the first gal in Council Bluffs to ever have a bas mitzvah. And
why did you have
I was 12 years old.
How was that decision?
Well, because my dad was very religious, and it was. I remember the rabbi that came. I don't know. I can't remember who I studied with, but I remember they had this Rabbi Jolt that came from Lincoln to officiate at my bar mitzvah. And Milt Brown, who lived, does that name anything? That lived in Council Bluffs, was asked to read some of a portion that a woman wasn't allowed to read in those days. And I didn't remember that part, but Milt Brown put it in one of those books that somebody was interviewing him. I'm sure you've got the book here too. Another thing, it has nothing to do with Judaism, except that growing up, Buddy Rothman and I were the only two Jews that graduated from AL, in my class. And growing up, and of course he wasn't we were in different neighborhoods, so he was not in my grade school classes. And through till ninth grade, they didn't have middle school. That it went from in Bloomer. I went to Bloomer High School, up to Bloomer grade school, and it went from kindergarten through ninth grade. All my friends, of course, weren't Jewish, and so my parents were very liberal, because I remember my fifth grade teacher had a Bible class that she had off of, I don't remember if it was on a weekend or whenever it was, and all my friends were going, so I wanted to go too, so I went too, and I listened to her Bible class, and of course it was Old Testament and New Testament stuff, which was, there's no harm in learning anything, kid. And also, we used to go caroling at Christmas time. My parents never objected to it, never. And we'd even go into the hospitals sometimes and, carol in there. I never was aware of any real prejudice in Councilors, but there must have been some kind of a unspoken kind of, if you know what I mean, prejudice. In Omaha they have what they call a Xarban Ball, and it's a big social thing. In the old days, Council Bluffs had one that was very similar, and it was called the Mardi Gras, and it was sponsored by a church, and it was very social, and it was at an auditorium. It was very well. I was the first Jewish person that was asked to be in that, and they had many of them before, but I was in college at the time. Now, when I was in high school, they used some high school people that are in it, like maids or something, and I was not asked. I did belong to Job's Daughters in Council Bluffs, which was I was the only one that ever did that. But when I was in college, I was asked to be a countess in the Mardi Gras. Well, it's kind of interesting that I was the first one, but after that, we had two kings that were Jewish. Harry Cohn was one, and Doc Sternhill was one. And there was one gal that was a queen, later on. I can't think of what her name is, but they had that Continental Keller furniture store, and she was a queen. I don't think they belonged to our synagogue. I think they went to Temple in Omaha. But I think people were very tolerant, but every once in a while you would hear, a phrase that would just greet you. If somebody's just shopping and the price is going to be a little less, and you know what they're going to say. I tried to Jew them down or something, and when they say that, they didn't mean any harm. This is the way they were raised, and this is how they heard it, and a lot of them, even when they would say it, weren't even aware, even though they knew we were Jewish, they would think that we maybe talk that way too. But I, of course, would find it offensive, but I just would ignore that too. Now let's talk about some of the people that
Sure, should we start with the Ickoviches?
Yeah, well, the Mr. Ishkovich, and what did we say his wife's name?
Janet?
Janet. Lovely people. They were lovely people. He was a classy man. He was little, but he always wore a jacket or suit or something. He was always just so proper, and he was such a nice man. And he worked for, of course, he couldn't speak English, and so my folks, it was kind of hard for him. But he would do anything that you asked him to do. And I don't know, I don't think he worked for us that long, but he had accumulated salary and that, and he went into a painting business. And he moved to Omaha, and his kids were all educated, and they were, I think, 2 boys, does it say, or did he have more than that?
I think there were 2 boys. The
2
oldest,
boys, I think.
Louis and...
Yeah, well, they were little kids then, but I remember they were bright. They went off to college. They must have gotten scholarships. They were, I'd love to know what happened to them now. But she was lovely. They were lovely people, very nice, and sure. And I don't know when Shirley Goldstein, when she got involved with, was she involved with these?
No.
Her folks were then.
Her folks were.
But Shirley was married. She probably married during the war, didn't she? So she was probably living in Omaha, but maybe raising families. So she probably didn't get involved until after her dad. But her folks were involved. Lena Grossman was a big, she did a lot of wonderful work. Israeli bonds, that woman was just, it wasn't even a soft sell kid. She wanted to make put Consulos on the map, and boy, she did too. And how about Frida Swarovski? She was the same way. They were real pro-Israel, everything, which is, everybody was pro-Israel, but they really took it upon themselves to promote Israel and to protect Israel. And it was wonderful. They had big bond drives in Council Bluffs. They'd bring in speakers, and they'd have you do a pledge, and everybody would come to synagogue. And our synagogue often would have dinners, just dinner, not just for that, but Eddie Tepperman used to be quite a cook, and he would cook dinners, and we'd all have everybody'd come to synagogue. There'd be a big dinner there. And that's why we have so many dishes in our cabinets to this day in the synagogue. 100 of everything that you could possibly, more than 100 probably. A pickle dish, if you need 100 of those, I know just where you're gonna find one. And we had one. I remembered the high holidays when just kids. Of course, you didn't stay inside if your parents were alive. They went for Yisker. They didn't want you in there, so they'd send you outside, and we'd all be out there on the steps or sliding down what looked like a banister on the side, or or whatever. We had a wonderful family. Leah and what was his name? Krasny. Uh, Anyhow, they were with the People Store. Great family. You remember Leah's husband's name? But he had a Pierce arrow, and Leah was very devoutly religious. She wouldn't ride on the holidays, but Lawrence is his name. He would drive to the synagogue in his Pierce arrow, and we'd all wait to see the car. It was wonderful, beautiful, beautiful car. And they had two sons, Les and Stanley. Stanley they both were extremely religious, like their mother. But Leah, as religious as she was always involved in community work in Council Bluffs. She was a businesswoman too. She was a wonderful, wonderful woman, involved with a lot of organizations that were just about Council Bluffs women or Chamber of Commerce or things like that. She was a terrific gal.
Then there was the Guevara family.
And the Guevara family, they came, I was not aware of this, but you said that he was not born a Jew.
That's right. He converted in the deep
but he did convert then. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Very nice. And he went to work for Future Foam, I think. And he was with them and they raised a nice family. I remember her, but he'd be in the store quite a bit because he was he worked for a company that needed, hardware. So we would see him, and he was he was easy to like, and the neighbors loved him, his neighbors. And they were a nice family. And all those people, I don't know if the Ichkoviches, did they move away, or do you have a record of that?
The children moved away.
No, but what about them? Are
No,
they
they
buried in Omaha? Mm-hmm. They're buried in Omaha. And Guevara, where are they buried? Are they in Council Bluffs?
That's a good question.
And I don't know if Friedman, I think Isaac Friedman, is in Council Bluffs. And I think maybe his wife is too.
So some of the folks who came really stayed and lived their whole lives.
Yes, they did. They did. Well, some of them came, they weren't so young either. Like when Friedman came, he was kind of an old man. He worked at the foundry, but he was not a young man. I mean, I was, when you're 15 and you see somebody that's 50, you think they're an old person. What do you don't realize at your age. But he was a lot older than his wife, I know. And he already had the grown son that he was estranged from, but that son was he was, he could have been 30 or more when he came to. So we had a great. Council Bluffs was terrific. It still isn't. It's still in my heart. It will always be my hometown.
Such a thriving Jewish community.
Yeah, it was. It was in those days. We had a lot of families, and we often had a rabbi. We had this wonderful young rabbi that was there, I think, at the time my dad died. He came from Chicago. He was young. He was Orthodox, and his wife was too. They had met, I think, at a seminary, meeting where they were both studying. She wasn't a rabbi, but she came from an Orthodox family, but they were very progressive. His parents were came to town one time, good-looking, well-dressed, interesting couple, and the father talked about that he belonged to the Playboy Club in Chicago. But this Rabbi Karzan was his last name, Karzan, and somebody was in Israel, maybe within the last 3-4 years, and he was residing there now. They're living there now, because he was a lot younger than me, and he used to do interesting classes. He'd talk about marriage, do a lot of marriage counseling and things. He was very, very interesting. He gave great sermons. He was a very nice young man.
Sissy,
Nice.
I've just got to ask you, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Since we have this opportunity.
Yeah.
How did it feel? How did you think about getting that bar mitzvah? Like, you're
When
studying.
I was doing my
Yeah, you're studying, and how did you feel about all that?
Well,
Did you feel
you know
special?
what? I felt about the same way as I felt when I had to go to Hebrew school, but it wasn't. It's not a blur in my memory, but it was. It just, and I can't even remember who I studied with. It must. We used to get some visiting rabbis that would come around, and some of them were these old guys with, that just didn't look. They would look unkept, and they were the smell. Everything about them was that you remember. You don't remember so much about what you were learning or anything, but it was. But I must have gone through it. I did it. I have the article where it was in the. I don't remember if it was in the press or in the probably was in both, and the Council was Nonpareil. That I was having a bas mitzvah. They called me Harriet. Everybody in school, everybody called me Harriet, and I still have friends that I went to school with that still call me Harriet. If I hear Harriet, then I know it's somebody from my youth. And I'll tell you what I ran into this week that it was so neat. My Uncle Abe Cattleman, he was the youngest brother of my dad, and he went into the Seabees during World War II. And you remember how nobody remembers, if you have to be old enough to remember, but they used to do V-mail. That would be, everything would be censored. I mean, any location was censored, or time. There would be a lot of things that would be. And it couldn't have been more than 2 weeks ago that I ran into a letter that he wrote. He used to, because, Lee Eveloff and I were the only two girls of all these 10 people, brothers and sisters. So they really, and Lee was quite a bit older than me, so they all used to dote, all the aunts and uncles used to dote on me. So when he was single, Abe was single for a long time. He didn't marry until he was in his 40s, I think. And he married a darling gal from Chicago, and within the first year she developed breast cancer, and they had a big wedding at the Blackstone Hotel, where everybody used to get married in that ballroom at the Blackstone Hotel. And maybe they were married a year and a half, I don't know. But I'll tell you when it was. I think senior, and it was either a junior or senior in high school, and that's when there was going to be a flood in Council Bluffs, and in Omaha too. The river was rising, and they had to have everybody had to go to work as a volunteer somewhere, and from school the guys all went down to the levee, and they were filling sandbags, and the gals and my friends, my bunch, they used to we'd go to the Masonic Temple and make sandwiches for the guys that were filling the sandbags, and on our side of the river it held, but it was a real group effort to keep it going. Somebody, I think, is out there looking pretty, I don't know, maybe not.
Those are great stories, Sissy.
Uh-huh.
Really great.
There's, is there somebody there looking
It's okay,
for you?
we're okay.
Are you all right?
That's fine.
Okay.
We can wrap up. Are there other things you want to talk about?
Well, we've talked about me. I could talk about for
It's wonderful.
I can talk for 84 years
It's
worth.
wonderful. You have some
but
really great stories.
But there are a lot of great stories, and then there was in my other life once I got married, so that was another life again. So it was wonderful.
When did the hardware store close?
Well, the state came through, and they were going to reroute Broadway, and they called it Canesville, and it required the whole block from between 8th Street, actually it went down almost to 6th Street, but from 8th Street, our store was between 7th and 8th Street, and that whole block, and it was a long block too, they had to eliminate the whole block because it was going right through there, and part of the next block into town as well, and so you had no option because it would be eminent domain if you didn't go, and so so we went, but you know, you hate to be told when you have to go, but when I think about it, the business world changed so much, you know. I mean, our hardware was unique in every way. It was, because we didn't do pots and pans. We were industrial hardware. We did industry, farm, construction, that kind of stuff. Big, projects, things like that. But along comes big lumber yards, big discount houses. It's not like it didn't have Amazon and things like that, but it was a whole different way of selling, and you know that. And my life had changed too. I had married. I wanted to. Of course, I married. In '75. This was in about '81, I think, that came through. And we wanted to do a lot of traveling, and it did afford us an opportunity to. I had the time then, and Howard, being 14 years older than me, he was approaching retirement too. They didn't tell him he had to. He could continue writing as long as he wanted to. But in the long run, it probably was the best, and especially for my mother, because she got to travel then. In fact, she traveled with your grandma. You know, they did a couple trips together. And so it was okay. It was fine.
She spent a lot of her life in that store.
Oh, absolutely, it was. And I can't tell you how many places would come around and do stories about us, and it would be in all kinds of magazines. In one in Des Moines, I remember they came, and of course the local papers did them all the time. But it was well, it was unique to have two women. You know, especially what we were selling, contractors and things like. They'd come in and they'd say, "Is there, you know, one of the men can?" And we did have men working for us, of course. Can they come? You know, they didn't think they could ask us something. We would be able to tell them. So I would call if they wanted a man. I would call one of the guys and have him. Well, they'd always turn him over to me, you know. But it was. But it was fun, and the people that you worked, not only the people that worked for us were wonderful, but our customers were wonderful too. We had just the nicest, even today when I go over, I mean most of them, the ones that I dealt with are gone now, but sometimes they'll say they came in with their folks, you know, and they remember. I was at the cemetery just about a week and a half ago, because I was doing something in where Howard's grave was, and our cemetery abuts the Catholic cemetery, and so I was going back to the car, and there was a couple over there that were there, and she just yells at me, "Are you Sissy?" And so I said yes, and she says, "Well, I used to come into your store when, you know, with so and so." She had to tell me when she told me who her dad was, and I did know who they. But how, you know, I think I've changed some since the 1980s, or not even the 80s. It'd be the 50s, 60s, you know. So. But that was kind of fun. I love going to Council Bluffs and being in Council Bluffs, because you do, well, every once in a while run into somebody and they'll have a great story about the hardware store, or of course I go to lunch with my high school class once a month, so we keep in touch with you know, with that. Although this Friday I'm going to the funeral for one of them too, so that happens too. So, but
No, that's great, Sissy.
life is wonderful. Is this going to too long now?
No,
for you?
no, it's not too long. But why don't we wrap up the formal interview?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I wish I could tell you more
No,
about
it's fantastic.
No, but I
actually.
wish I could tell you more about the refugees.
No, it's all right.
But
It's all right.
they.
Actually, I think what you know is great.
Well, I don't. I wish I knew somebody else that had some contact with them. You know, some of them worked in the grocery stores, so I'm trying to think if there were any kids that might have been a grandkid at
It's all
that
right.
time.
You know what? It's enough, in the sense that what we're trying to do in the exhibit is to show that this happened. You
Yeah.
know? I mean,
Yeah.
that's because